You know, I've always considered myself a rational guy. Born and raised in Salem, Massachusetts, I grew up surrounded by tales of witches and curses, yet I never really bought into any of it. To me, it was all just part of the town's charm, a way to keep the tourists interested, you know. But being a historian, I've always had this unquenchable thirst for the truth, for facts. I dig through old records, looking for the stories behind the legends, convinced that every tale had a logical explanation. I guess that's what led me to the forest that night. I was curious, maybe a little too curious, and decided to see if there was anything behind the whispers I'd been hearing. It was just another evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I was working late, as usual, diving into some old manuscripts when I came across a reference to an ancient clearing deep in the woods. The text hinted at strange occurrences, rituals performed under the cover of darkness. Most would have dismissed it as nonsense, but not me. I've always believed that behind every myth, there's a kernel of truth. So I grabbed my coat and set out to see what I could find. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that bites just a bit, making you feel alive. Little did I know, this wasn't going to be just another one of my harmless investigations. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of the town faded, replaced by the eerie stillness of the forest. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it became, like I was crossing some invisible threshold. Then, suddenly, I heard a faint chanting carried by the wind. I followed the sound, my curiosity getting the better of me, until I stumbled upon a clearing. The sight that greeted me was beyond anything I could have imagined. There, around a roaring fire, stood a group of women, their faces obscured by the shadows, their voices rising in a language I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was some kind of historical reenactment, maybe a group of enthusiasts playing at being witches. But as I watched, something changed. The air grew heavy, thick with a palpable sense of dread, and the women, they started to change too. Their features twisted, becoming grotesque, almost inhuman. It hit me like a ton of bricks these weren't just women in costumes. These were the witches, the very ones from Salem's dark past, brought back to life by some unspeakable force. And the ritual they were performing wasn't some harmless play acting. It was real, a curse meant to bring about a disaster centuries from now. In that moment, I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I wanted to run, to turn back and pretend none of this was happening, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, forced to witness the horror unfolding before me. Then, as if sensing my presence, one of them turned. Her eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. Somehow, I managed to tear myself away and ran like hell, my heart pounding in my ears. But no matter how far I got, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I was no longer the same person who had entered that forest. When I finally made it home, my body was trembling, drenched in sweat. I collapsed into my chair, my breath ragged, trying to convince myself it was all a dream, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the pain in my chest said otherwise. I hesitated for a long time before pulling up my shirt to look, and when I did, I nearly passed out. There on my skin was a mark, a strange, twisted symbol that pulsed with a dark energy, almost as if it was alive. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some random scar. It was a brand, a mark left by the witches, a sign that I'd been chosen for something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. You know, after that night, everything changed. It wasn't just the mark that haunted me, though God knows that was bad enough. No, it was everything else too. The nightmares started first, creeping into my sleep like unwelcome guests. Every night, without fail, I'd find myself back in that forest, watching those witches, hearing their chants. But it wasn't just a replay of what happened. No, these dreams were worse. I'd see visions of a world in ruins, a future so twisted and dark it made my skin crawl. The witches were always there too, whispering that it was all my fault, that I'd brought this on myself by stumbling into their cursed ritual. I tried to brush it off at first, chalking it up to stress or maybe even a guilty conscience. After all, I'd been poking around where I shouldn't have, hadn't I? But the dreams didn't stop. In fact, they got worse, more vivid, more terrifying. And then the symbols started appearing. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I mean, who wouldn't? You wake up in the middle of the night, half asleep, and you see something out of the corner of your eye, of course. You're gonna think it's nothing, right? But these symbols weren't going away. I'd see them etched into the walls, drawn in what looked like blood, always in places where I knew they hadn't been before. I tried everything, scrubbing the walls, painting over them, even moving furniture to cover them up, but nothing worked. The symbols kept coming back, more detailed, more menacing each time. And it wasn't just that. There were voices too. At first, they were just faint whispers, like the wind through the trees, but soon they became clearer, almost like someone was standing right next to me, murmuring in my ear. They'd say things, horrible things, mocking me, telling me I was cursed, that there was no escape. And the worst part, I was starting to believe them. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see their faces, hear their voices, feel that mark on my chest burning like it was fresh all over again. I was barely eating, barely functioning, and it wasn't long before people started noticing. Friends, neighbors, they'd ask if I was okay, say I looked tired or stressed, and I'd just nod, forcing a smile, telling them I was fine. But inside, I was anything but fine. I was falling apart, piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. I'd even tried cleansing the house, bringing in everything from priests to New Age healers, but nothing worked. The darkness just kept growing, and I felt like I was losing my mind. It wasn't just my mind, though. My body was starting to give out too. I'd get these sharp pains, like something was clawing at me from the inside, and every time it happened, the mark on my chest would flare up, glowing a sickly red. I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. And the worst part was, I had no one to turn to. No one would understand. How could they? To them, I'd sound like a lunatic, ranting about witches and curses. But it was real. I knew it was real, even if I couldn't prove it. And that realization, knowing I was alone in this, that was the scariest thing of all. You know, I thought I could find help if I just reached out, if I just told someone what was happening. But the thing is, no one wants to hear about witches and curses in this day and age. I started with my closest friends, the ones who'd known me for years, the ones I thought would understand. But as soon as I started talking about the clearing, about the ritual, I saw it in their eyes. They thought I'd lost it. They tried to be polite, you know, nodding along, offering weak smiles, but I could tell they didn't believe a word I was saying. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. If our roles were reversed, I'm not sure I would have believed me either. I didn't give up right away, though. I figured maybe it was just too much for them to take in all at once. So I tried again, this time with my family. They'd always been supportive, always had my back, so I thought, maybe, just maybe, they'd listen. But the moment I started mentioning the witches, my mom gave me this look like she was trying to figure out how to tell me gently that I needed help. My dad, he just shook his head, muttering something about work stress getting to me. My sister, well, she laughed it off, saying I'd been spending too much time with my nose in those old books. It was like a punch to the gut, realizing that even they couldn't see what was happening to me. Desperation started to creep in, so I went to the authorities. I knew it was a long shot, but I thought maybe if I could just show them the mark or the symbols in my house, they'd take me seriously. But when I walked into that station and started talking, they didn't even try to hide their disbelief. The officer at the desk just stared at me, like he was trying to figure out if I was pulling some kind of prank. When I showed him the mark, he shrugged it off, saying it looked like nothing more than a scar, probably something I'd done to myself without realizing. As for the symbols, they didn't even bother sending someone to check. Said it was probably just kids messing around, graffiti, nothing more. That was the moment it hit me I was on my own. No one was going to believe me, no matter how many times I told the story, no matter how much evidence I thought I had. I started to withdraw, pulling away from everyone and everything. Why bother trying to convince people who are never going to listen? I stopped going out, stopped answering calls, stopped trying to explain myself. The isolation was suffocating, but it felt safer than facing the disbelief, the pity in their eyes. And all the while, the nightmares kept getting worse, the voices louder, the symbols more threatening. It was like the witches were closing in on me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, but what scared me the most was that I didn't even care anymore. The constant rejection, the endless skepticism, it wore me down, made me question everything. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could feel the curse, feel it tightening its hold on me with every passing day. And the more I tried to fight it, the more it seemed to drag me down into darkness. There were moments when I thought about giving up, just letting it take me, because what was the point in fighting a battle I'd already lost? But then there were moments of clarity, brief flashes where I could see through the fog of despair. In those moments, I'd think about what the witches had done, about the curse they'd set in motion. I couldn't let it end like this. I couldn't just fade away, leaving the world to face the horrors they'd unleashed. So I started writing everything down, every detail, every nightmare, every symbol. If no one would listen, maybe someday someone would find my journal, piece together what had happened. It wasn't much, but it was all I had left, a desperate hope that my story wouldn't end in silence, that maybe, just maybe, someone would believe. There comes a point when desperation pushes you to do things you never thought you would. For me, that moment came late one night, when the whispers in my house became too much to bear. They were louder than ever, their voices overlapping, creating a cacophony of torment that drove me to the edge. I couldn't take it anymore. Something inside me snapped, and before I knew it, I was grabbing my coat, heading out the door. I wasn't sure where I was going at first. Maybe I just needed to get out, away from the house, away from the voices. But as I walked, a strange clarity came over me. I knew where I had to go and what I had to do. I had to go back to the forest. The night was darker than I'd ever seen it, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. But I didn't care. My feet moved on their own, guided by some instinct I couldn't explain. The forest loomed ahead, the trees casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach out for me. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I'd been through too much, seen too much, to let fear stop me. As I crossed the threshold into the woods, the air grew thick, almost suffocating, like the forest itself was alive, watching me, waiting. The path was overgrown, but I didn't need to see it to know where I was going. I could feel it, like the witches were pulling me back to them. When I reached the clearing, I almost didn't recognize it. The place that had been so alive with dark energy, the last time I was here, was now nothing more than a patch of overgrown weeds, the fire pit cold and forgotten. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it all, if the witches, the ritual, the curse, if it had all been some twisted dream. But then I saw it, lying in the center of the clearing, half buried under a pile of dead leaves. A book. Not just any book, though. This one was old, its cover cracked and weathered, bound in what looked like human skin. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't look away. I knew this was what I'd been led here to find. My hands shook as I reached for the book, a part of me screaming not to touch it, to leave it buried and forgotten. But something else, something stronger, pushed me forward. I had to know. I had to understand. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, a wave of heat shot through me, like the book was alive, feeding off my fear. I almost dropped it, but I couldn't let go. Not now. I opened the cover, and the pages inside were filled with symbols, the same ones that had been haunting my walls. As I flipped through, the words seemed to writhe on the page, twisting and shifting until they formed a single horrifying sentence. The curse is sealed within you. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to tremble, a low rumble that grew into a full-blown quake. I stumbled back, the book slipping from my grasp as the earth split open around me. Flames erupted from the ground, and I could feel the heat scorching my skin. The clearing was alive with power, with the same dark energy I'd felt that first night. But this time, it was different. This time, I was at the center of it, and there was no escape. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The witches had never intended for me to stop them. They'd marked me, cursed me, so that I would carry their power, their darkness, with me wherever I went. I was their vessel, their weapon, and there was nothing I could do to change that. The flames rose higher, encircling me, trapping me in a ring of fire. I could hear the witches' voices, chanting in that same ancient language, their words echoing in my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, my fate sealed. As the flames closed in, I felt the mark on my chest burn brighter, hotter, until it was all I could feel, all I could see. The world around me faded into nothingness, and in that moment, I knew I would never escape this. The curse wasn't just a part of me now. It was me. You know, after that night in the forest, something inside me changed. I wasn't just haunted by the nightmares or the whispers in my home. No, it was deeper than that. It was like a darkness had settled into my bones, a creeping realization that I was no longer in control of my own life. But even then, a part of me held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, I could still fight this. I couldn't just give up, not after everything I'd been through. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started writing. I poured everything into a journal, documenting every twisted detail, every terrifying vision, hoping that if I couldn't save myself, at least I could leave something behind. Something that might warn others. Day by day, I felt myself slipping further away from the person I used to be. The mark on my chest was a constant reminder of the curse that now defined me. It pulsed with a dark energy, one that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. My health deteriorated rapidly. I could barely eat. Sleep was a distant memory, and my thoughts were clouded by a constant sense of dread. I knew I was dying, that the witches had drained the life out of me, but I couldn't stop writing. It was all I had left, my last act of defiance against the curse that had consumed me. As the days turned into weeks, my isolation deepened. No one believed me, of course, and I'd long since stopped trying to convince them. What was the point? They couldn't see what I was going through. To them, I was just another casualty of Salem's dark history, another story to be forgotten. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't escape the horror of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. The journal became my only companion, the only thing that kept me tethered to the world. But even that was slipping away. My hands shook as I wrote, the words blurring on the page as my vision failed me. But I kept going, driven by the fear that if I stopped, the darkness would consume me completely. I don't know how much time passed before I realized that I was losing my mind. The nightmares had become so vivid, so real, that I could no longer tell where the dreams ended and reality began. The voices, once faint whispers, now screamed in my ears, filling my head with their cursed words. I was trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and despair, and I knew there was no way out. But still I wrote. I wrote about the witches, about the ritual, about the mark that had condemned me to this fate. I wrote about the visions of the future, the world they had cursed to destruction. And with each word, I felt the last remnants of my sanity slipping away. I knew my time was running out. The curse had taken everything from me, my health, my mind, my life. But there was one thing it couldn't take, one thing I still had control over, my story. I poured every ounce of my remaining strength into that journal, determined to leave behind a record of what had happened, of what I had seen. I knew no one would believe me, not at first. But maybe someday, someone would find it. Maybe they'd read my words and understand the truth. Maybe they'd believe. It was a slim hope, but it was all I had left. And so I wrote until I couldn't write anymore, until the darkness closed in and the pen slipped from my fingers. When I finally put down the journal, I knew it was over. I could feel the end coming, a cold inevitability that settled over me like a shroud. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd done all I could, fought as hard as I knew how. The curse would take me, yes, but it wouldn't silence me. My story would live on, even if I didn't. As I lay there, the last of my strength fading, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would the world heed my warning? Or would they, like so many before, dismiss it as nothing more than the ravings of a madman? I suppose I'll never know. But as the darkness finally claimed me, I found a strange sense of peace in the knowledge that I had done everything I could.